It was one of those orchestrated days at the White House. Bright, crowded, and brimming with power. The East Room buzzed with calculated energy, diplomats murmuring near the curtains, aides brushing past with tablets, and every camera trained on the two men at the center, President Donald Trump and Elon Musk. They stood close, talking comfortably. Trump, expressive, assured, always in command. Musk, measured, sharp-eyed, with a kind of stillness that suggested his mind was always somewhere just beyond the room. Cameras flashed, laughter drifted. But just to the side, nearly invisible in that sea of ambition, stood a little boy. 5 years old, thin arms curled around his father's pant leg. His name was X. X was clinging to Elon's suit jacket like it was the only stable thing in a world that felt too big. The boy's wide eyes scanned the room, unsure. Everything about him said he didn't belong here, at least not yet. Trump noticed him. Maybe it was instinct, or maybe something else. His expression softened. He leaned down, lowering himself from the world of generals and billionaires to the level of a child. "Well, hello there," he said gently. "You enjoying your visit to the White House?" X looked up shyly, gave a quick nod, and then hesitated. His small hand stayed tucked behind his back, clutching something tightly. Elon nudged him gently. "Go on," he whispered. "You've been waiting for this." The boy stepped forward, cheeks flushed with courage and fear. "I made this," he said, voice barely above a breath. "Daddy helped." Trump smiled. "Can I see it?" With trembling fingers, X extended a small, clumsily wrapped box. The paper was crinkled and uneven, the string crooked. It looked completely out of place, like a handwritten note slipped into a briefing folder. But Trump didn't laugh. He knelt all the way down and accepted it with both hands. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "I'll open it later, all right?" The boy nodded, still not meeting his eyes. Trump reached out and tousled his hair. "You're a brave little guy," he added, standing up again. Elon smiled faintly. "He's been planning this for weeks." Trump turned the box over in his hand, bemused and touched. "Well then," he said with a chuckle, "I guess I've just been gifted the most important item of the day." The day swept on. More speeches, more cameras, discussions of Mars, infrastructure, and the future of American dominance. But as the event unfolded, Trump's fingers kept brushing the inside of his jacket, where the boy's gift now rested, tucked away like a whisper he couldn't ignore. It wasn't the first gift he'd received, not by a long shot. Over the years there had been statues, rare coins, autographed books, medals dipped in history, but never this. Never something so small, so messy, so human. That night, long after the guests had left and the lights of the White House dimmed, Trump returned to the residence. The room was quiet, for once truly still. He sat heavily at his desk, removed his tie, and exhaled deeply, the kind of breath you take when you think no one's watching anymore. Then he remembered the box. He pulled it out slowly, hands suddenly unsure. He stared at it, creased paper, child's fingers evident in the folds. Carefully, he undid the string. Inside was a photo. A simple, grainy image. Earth, floating alone in the dark. The blue marbled swirl against infinite black. The edges were smudged with tiny fingerprints. And beneath it, a note. Written in Elon's careful handwriting but clearly dictated by the boy. "Daddy says we're tiny dots who think we're big. Don't forget to look up." Trump froze. The room, the history, the weight of the presidency, it all seemed to fall silent. He could have joked, he could have said something brash like, "I'm the biggest dot of all." But the words didn't come. Instead, something in him cracked. And for the first time in decades, Donald Trump felt small. The morning after the summit began like any other. Briefings stacked high, staffers flowing in and out, the usual flurry of movement that defined life in the West Wing. But something was off. Trump sat at his desk, the worn photograph now placed just to the side of his notepad. It wasn't centered, it wasn't framed in gold, but his eyes kept returning to it, again and again. It wasn't just the image, it was the smudges, the faint fingerprints of a child who had no idea what a president was, who had touched that photo with the kind of reverence adults forget how to feel. And somehow, it unsettled him. He'd built an empire out of being seen, louder, grander, more dominant than anyone else in the room. But now, a child's quiet message had slipped beneath the surface of all that. It didn't scream, it whispered, and yet it stayed. That day, during a particularly sharp cabinet meeting, his Secretary of Defense pushed hard for an increase in military presence overseas. The tone was familiar, assertive, strategic. Trump leaned back, fingers lightly grazing the photo beside him. He didn't interrupt immediately, he listened, really listened. And then, when everyone expected him to cut in with a signature punchline or a bold declaration, he said simply, "Let's hold off." Silence. He let it stretch, longer than most were comfortable with. "Maybe," he continued, "strength isn't always measured by how much power we show. Sometimes it's how much we choose not to use it." That was new. That wasn't the man they had come to expect. Staffers glanced at each other, uncertain, some intrigued, some unsettled. But no one challenged it. He dismissed the room early. Back in the stillness of the Oval Office, Trump walked slowly to the window, the cold glass pressing against his knuckles. The south lawn stretched beneath him, perfectly trimmed, perfectly staged. And yet, for the first time in a long while, it looked small. His reflection blurred in the glass. He was used to seeing himself larger than life, headlines and legacy, victories and towers. But now the face that looked back at him seemed different. Quiet, older, almost curious. Later that afternoon, a knock interrupted his thoughts. Barron entered, textbook in hand, still in his school uniform. "Hey," Trump said softly, a little surprised by the comfort in his own tone. "Shouldn't you be in class?" "Online day," Barron shrugged. "You busy?" he added almost cautiously. Trump smiled faintly. "Never too busy for you. Sit down." Barron dropped into the chair opposite his father, eyes quickly landing on the photograph. "What's this?" Trump hesitated. "A gift," he said finally, "from Elon Musk's boy, X." Barron picked it up, examining the smudged corners. "Why Earth?" Trump's answer came slowly. He said, "It's to remind me I'm just a tiny dot." Barron blinked, clearly caught off guard. "You? A tiny dot?" Trump laughed, really laughed. "That's what I thought too." Barron stared at the photo a little longer, then looked up with surprising sincerity. "Maybe it's good," he said quietly. Trump tilted his head. "Good?" "Yeah," Barron continued. "You always say everything matters, every detail, every win. It must be exhausting. Maybe thinking smaller makes things feel lighter." Trump didn't respond at first. He just watched his son. There was no agenda in Barron's words, no strategy, just honesty. And for a man used to managing optics and perception, it landed like a balm. "When did you get so wise?" Trump asked, voice softer than expected. Barron smirked. "Probably from Mom." They both chuckled. And in that moment, amid the quiet hum of the building, the muffled sounds of Washington beyond those walls, Trump felt something unusual. Release. That night, Trump found himself wide awake. The residence was quiet, more so than usual. No phone calls, no briefings, no news tickers flashing across screens. Just silence, thick and warm, the kind that wraps around you when the world has stopped expecting. He walked alone down the hall and into the Oval Office. The lamp on his desk glowed softly, casting long shadows across the room. There it was again, the photograph. Still. He reached out and touched the frame. The grainy image of Earth stared back. Worn, imperfect, alive. He wondered who took it. Some astronaut floating miles above the surface, camera in hand, staring down at a world that had no idea he was watching. Was that what X saw? That kind of distance? That kind of clarity? Trump leaned back in the leather chair, fingers steepled. He remembered a moment from years ago, decades even. A charity event in Manhattan. A young girl had approached him nervously, holding a handmade drawing of one of his buildings. The proportions were off, the lines crooked, but she'd labeled it Mr. Trump's Tower, the tallest in the world. He'd barely glanced at it, signed it with a sharp black marker, and moved on. He couldn't even recall her name. But now he remembered the look in her eyes. Pure pride, pure joy. And how quickly he dismissed it. He closed his eyes. How many of those moments had he missed? Or worse, crushed under the weight of his own importance. The thought stung in a place he didn't often visit. He opened a drawer and took out the note again. X's message. The handwriting awkward, the message devastatingly clear. Don't forget to look up. A knock on the door interrupted the stillness. It was Melania. She entered quietly, sensing his mood without needing to ask. Her eyes landed on the photograph. "You've been staring at that thing for hours," she said gently. He didn't deny it. She stepped closer, studied the picture for a moment, then smiled faintly. "It's beautiful, humble." Trump looked at her, surprised by the word. "Humble?" She nodded. "You don't have many humble things." He let out a low chuckle, part self-deprecating, part resigned. "You think I needed this?" "I think you needed something," she said softly, "and maybe this is it." They stood together for a while in silence. Eventually she kissed his cheek and left, the door closing behind her with a whisper. Trump stayed seated, the note still in his hand. The boy had no idea what he'd done. He wasn't trying to make a statement. He wasn't angling for press or influence. He was simply telling the truth, in the only way a child knows how. Simple, and it pierced. For a man who had spent his life building things to be seen, the idea that something so quiet could matter this much, it was unmooring. He sat forward, placing the photo back in its exact spot. The lamplight caught the fingerprint smudges once more. He didn't wipe them off, didn't even try. They belonged there, a permanent mark, a reminder, a tether to something real. The next morning, the usual weight returned. The meetings, the notes, the endless cascade of demands that turned the presidency into something more like performance than leadership. Trump sat at the resolute desk again, pen in hand, eyes flicking between policy drafts and intelligence memos. But none of it felt real. Not entirely. It was like reading about someone else's world. The photograph remained within arm's reach. That's when Barron walked in again. No textbook this time. Just him. "You have a minute?" he asked. Trump nodded. "Always." Barron hesitated at the desk before speaking. "I told Mom about the picture." Trump looked up. "Yeah?" She said it reminded her of the time I asked you about the stars when I was a kid. Trump blinked. Barron continued, "You said stars didn't matter, that they didn't make money." A long silence followed. Trump leaned back, the memory rushing back with startling clarity. Summer, on the deck of a boat. His daughter Ivanka was there too. Barron had pointed at the sky, and he'd brushed it off, not cruelly, just impatiently, focused on things that felt more practical at the time. He swallowed the regret slowly. "I was wrong," Trump admitted. Barron didn't gloat, didn't smirk. He just nodded, accepting it with a grace most adults couldn't manage. "I think," the boy said softly, "you've been different lately." "Better or worse?" Trump asked, half joking. "Quieter." Trump raised an eyebrow. "Is that good?" Barron thought for a moment, then shrugged. "It fits." They both laughed lightly. Trump tapped the desk with his fingertips, glancing again at the photo. "You know," he said, "I've spent my whole life trying to be the loudest voice in the room, the biggest presence. That picture, it makes me feel like I don't need to be." Barron looked at him carefully. "Maybe you never did." Those words struck deeper than expected. They didn't come from a political advisor, not from a general, a strategist, or a pollster. They came from a boy, his son. And they landed like truth. Later that day, Elon Musk returned to the White House for a private meeting. There were no cameras, no press, just two men in the Oval Office, sitting across from one another. Elon's eyes drifted quickly to the photograph. A quiet smile formed on his face. "He kept it," he said softly. Trump nodded. "It's the most important thing on this desk." Elon studied him for a moment. "I didn't expect that." "Neither did I," Trump replied, his tone calm, almost introspective. "But your boy? He gave me something no adults ever managed." Elon tilted his head. "A shift?" Trump nodded slowly. "A reminder." They sat in silence for a few seconds, one of those rare, unhurried silences where nothing needs to be said. Trump finally added, "I used to think the world was mine to conquer. Now I think it's mine to care for." Elon smiled faintly. "Sometimes children show us what vision really is." Trump leaned forward slightly. "Tell X I'm grateful, more than he'll understand right now." "I will," Elon said quietly. As Elon stood to leave, Trump stopped him. "You know," he said thoughtfully, whatever this is, it's the first thing that's made me feel honest in years." Elon paused at the door, hand on the frame. "Then hold on to it." When the door closed behind him, Trump turned again to the photo. It was still grainy, still crooked in its frame, still smudged with fingerprints. But to him, it looked like something new every time he looked at it. Not just a planet, not just a photo, but a map back to himself. The days blurred, meetings came and went, policy memos stacked and vanished. Faces passed through the Oval Office, ambassadors, advisors, dignitaries. But no one noticed the quiet change, except those who paid attention. His aides began to see it first, not in announcements or headlines, but in pauses. Pauses where there used to be quick judgments, moments where Trump would stop, really stop, and look someone in the eye before responding. Not out of strategy, but something closer to presence. The photograph never moved from his desk. Staffers noticed it, of course. A child's gift sitting among gold-plated pens and military commendations. No one dared ask about it, but they saw the way he glanced at it before big decisions, and they adjusted accordingly. One afternoon, a tense meeting erupted over an escalating overseas conflict. Voices rose, proposals slammed onto the table. The Secretary of Defense pushed hard. "We have the capability. We should respond before they test our resolve." All eyes turned to the president. Trump didn't speak immediately. Instead, his gaze drifted, not to the generals, not to the map, but to the small photograph across his desk. Earth, so impossibly small, so alone. He let the silence stretch until it softened the room. Then he said, "Let's wait." Murmurs, confused glances. "Maybe showing power isn't always the same as having it," he added quietly. The room shifted. Not because of volume, but because of weight. The kind of weight that only comes when someone you thought was unshakable chooses stillness over force. Later that day, he sat alone once again in the Oval Office. The room felt both cavernous and close. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the floor. He opened a drawer and pulled out the letter he'd started weeks ago. It was addressed to X. Unsent, unread, but not forgotten. He added a single line, "You reminded me what power can't fix." Then folded it again and tucked it back into place. That evening, Barron joined him for a walk. The sun had set, leaving the sky a soft gradient of purple and blue. They walked slowly through the rows of headstones at Arlington National Cemetery. Trump didn't speak for a long time. Then, gently, he said, "You ever think about it? All these names, all these lives. They mattered." Barron nodded. "Every single one." Trump looked at him, and not because they were big or powerful, but because they were human. Barron took a breath, letting the weight of that idea settle. Trump placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "I think I forgot that, somewhere along the way." There was no reply, just quiet, and in that quiet, something healed. The days that followed were quieter. Not in the world outside. Washington still buzzed with the usual noise, but inside him, something had settled. Something had shifted, and those around him began to feel it. His staff noticed the difference not in policy, but in tone. He listened more, asked questions more gently, took longer to respond. And when he did, it wasn't to dominate, but to connect. One morning, unannounced, he visited the children's ward at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center. No cameras, no press. He sat beside hospital beds, held the hands of worried parents, and spoke not as a president, but as a man trying to understand pain. The photo stayed on his desk, always within reach. That night, after dinner with Melania, he sat in the study, lights dimmed low, the house quiet except for the faint rustling of papers in the hallway. She entered gently and sat across from him. "You've been different," she said quietly. He looked up from the photograph. "Is that bad?" "No," she answered. "It suits you." He smiled faintly. "I don't know if I'm changing or finally becoming who I should have been all along." Melania studied him. Trump reached into his jacket and pulled out the folded note from X, the one with the photograph. He handed it to her silently. She unfolded it. "Read the boy's words slowly. Tiny dots who think we're big. Don't forget to look up." Her eyes lingered on the sentence. She looked at her husband and said softly, "Maybe that's what we all forget." Trump's voice was low, almost a whisper. "I spent years chasing headlines, towers, titles, thinking they made me important. And now?" He exhaled deeply. "Now I think small might actually be stronger, quiet might be louder, humility might be power." Melania reached across the table and gently took his hand. No more needed to be said. That night, in the solitude of the residence, he wrote another letter. Not for X, not for the press, but for Barron. He didn't address it formally. No dear son, no with love. Just the words. Never confuse size with importance. The smallest dot can change everything. He folded the letter carefully and tucked it into a drawer, then turned off the lamp. The room fell into soft darkness, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel alone in it. The last weeks of his presidency arrived quietly. There were no grand announcements, no dramatic shifts. The media kept spinning legacy debates, charting polls, projecting how history would write his name. But Trump didn't pay attention. Instead, he spent time in places he used to avoid. Community centers, local schools, quiet churches. No entourage, just him. Listening. One afternoon he asked Barron to join him again in the garden. The air was cool, the trees bare from winter. X was there too, walking beside his father Elon. They'd come for a private goodbye. No reporters, no photo ops. Trump crouched to X's level once more. "I still have your gift," he said warmly. "Every day I look at it." X smiled, shy and proud. "It changed me," Trump added softly. "More than I ever expected." The boy didn't fully understand. Not yet. But he nodded anyway, as if part of him did. Later, as the sun dipped behind the trees, Trump and Elon stood together, watching their sons chase each other through the quiet grass. "I didn't think the photo would reach you," Elon admitted. Trump smiled faintly. "Neither did I." They stood in silence for a while. Then Trump said, "I spent most of my life trying to prove how big I was." "And now?" Elon asked. Trump's voice was lower now, grounded. "Now I think real strength is knowing how small we are, and still choosing to care." Elon nodded. "That's what makes us bigger." Trump shook his head gently. "No, that's what makes us human." That evening, he returned to the Oval Office alone one last time. Boxes had been packed. Staff had said their goodbyes. The room felt hollow, like it was waiting to be emptied. He walked slowly to the desk and picked up the photograph. He held it longer this time, then walked it carefully to the drawer where he had placed the letter for X. He opened the envelope, placed the photo inside, and sealed it. He addressed it with one line: "To the boy who reminded me to look up." As he placed the envelope into Baron's hands later that night, he said quietly, "Give this to X when the time feels right, not sooner." Baron nodded seriously. Trump placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "You understand why it matters, don't you?" Baron didn't hesitate, because small things change people more than big ones do. Trump smiled. "You're ready." And then he let it go. The next morning, the car waited at the north portico. Melania stood by his side, Baron just behind him. Before stepping out, Trump turned one last time toward the room. No audience, no applause, just one final look at the chair he'd once seen as a throne. He exhaled slowly and whispered, not to anyone in particular, "Thank you, X." Then he stepped into the light. Some stories change policies, others shift nations, but once in a while, a quiet story changes a person. And maybe in the end, that's the only kind that matters. At Celeb Uncovered, we believe legacies aren't just written in headlines. Sometimes they're whispered in small moments, by small voices, with big meaning. What about you? Have you ever been changed by something simple? Something small, but unforgettable? Share it with us in the comments below. If this story touched something in you, if it made you pause, reflect, or simply breathe a little deeper, tap the like button to let us know. And if you believe in stories that reveal the human side of power, that pull back the curtain just enough to remind us what matters most, consider subscribing to Celeb Uncovered. There's more to see, more to feel, and more to remember. God bless you, and God bless America.